Presentation, I'm going to consider the rule of law in Herodotus in the light of modern case law. I'm going to compare and contrast the modern and the Herodotean concept of the rule of law. I'm also going to argue that in both the modern and the ancient concept, there are both thick and thin versions. I'm going to examine the Spartans' despotes nomos. And finally, I'm going to use the stories of Deioces and Astyages as case studies on the rule of law and tyranny in the histories. On the 24th of September 2019, the Supreme Court in the United Kingdom had a question to answer. Had the Prime Minister acted unlawfully in ending the parliamentary session from the middle of September to the middle of October? The official term for this action is prorogation, a power given to the Prime Minister under what is known as the royal prerogative, because in the past it was exercised by the monarch. The modern constitutional convention is that the Queen acts on the advice of the Prime Minister. In the event, decided that the Prime Minister had acted unlawfully in advising the Queen to prorogue Parliament. It referred to a 17th century case of 1611, which held that the King hath no prerogative but that which the law of the land allows him. The Supreme Court also reasserted the principle that every prerogative power has its limits, and that ministers are accountable to Parliament to ensure due scrutiny and to protect citizens from the arbitrary exercise of executive power. The Supreme Court thereby declared the rule of law, holding that the Prime Minister's actions were unlawful, null, and of no effect. In Lady Hale's words, it was as if the commissioners who carried out the act of prorogation had walked into Parliament with a blank piece of paper. So to summarise, although the royal prerogative in theory is a sovereign right subject to no restriction or interference, in practice it is subject to the law of the land and it has limits, and Parliament must be able to scrutinise the executive to protect against arbitrary acts by those in power. It is striking that the unanimous decision of 11 law lords refers to a case from the early 17th century, well before the settlement of 1688, which placed constitutional controls on royal power, and well before the development of parliamentary democracy in the 19th and early 20th centuries. It shows, therefore, that the concept of the rule of law can exist in the absence of democracy, however that is defined, and that is significant for my presentation today. We need to distinguish between thin and thick definitions of the rule of law. The thin definition constrains individuals and communities and is a potent agent of social control, and also offers some protection from lawlessness in providing stable government and a system of adjudicating disputes. However, it can also institutionalize forms of injustice. Slavery, of course, was legalized in 19th century America, so fits a thin definition of the rule of law, but is the antithesis of a modern thick definition, which is based on a concept of unalienable human rights. This thick definition is a normative ideal, acting as a bulwark against tyranny, setting limits on the exercise of power and condemning arbitrary acts by those in power. I'm going to turn now to the two passages in the histories where Herodotus refers to the rule of law. Firstly as despot, secondly as king. These both emphasize the power of law, of nomos, both as external coercive force and as internal form of social control. In Book 7, when Xerxes has invaded Greece, he has a conversation with Demaratus, the exiled Spartan king. He wants to know more about the Greek forces that will be fighting the Persians and whether they will resist. Fear of a single leader, he says, might men be better than their nature, their physis, and take on a numerically superior force, but they would never do that, he says, if they're free. Demaratus then introduces Xerxes to the Spartan military nomos, which compels men to win or die. Nomos is an external despotic force which men fear more than the command of a tyrant. In my second example, Herodotus as narrator observes that people have an internal attachment to their own laws. The regulation of everyday life is a key aspect of the rule of law in the histories. Herodotus's observation is in the context of people's traditional nomoi. In this case, the burial practices of both Greeks and Indians. The rule of law in this instance is an internal rule which makes nomos king of all. People are attached to their own rules, however strange or abhorrent they may seem to others, and sometimes punish those who try to introduce foreign practices. The Scythians, for example, reject others' nomoi, punishing those who try to introduce them, even their king Scyles. The rule of law here is based on social control and communal pressure. These are the rules of the group, which must be internalized. They confer a sense of belonging, of collective identity. In both these cases, we are a long way from a law court. The Supreme Court judgment is based on an institutional framework which envisages some form of published legal code, statute, or case law, law courts where legal disputes are decided, and an independent judiciary. Lord Reid emphasises the central role of the courts in this 2017 judgment, as does Lord Bingham in his definition of the rule of law. If we were to be studying the rule of law in classical Athens, we would be referring to the forensic speeches of the Attic orators delivered in the law courts. These speeches and what we know of Athenian legal institutions would be our starting point. This is a key difference between the modern and the Athenian concept of the rule of law and the one we find in the histories. Different institutional considerations apply. When Herodotus says, "I think Pindar was right to say in his poem that law is king of all," he's not talking about access to a court. It's quite possible that he had never been in a law court or heard a forensic speech. In that sense, his experience is likely to be very different from those members of his audience who were Athenian. In fact, I have only found one forensic speech in the histories, that of Thearides in Book 6, when he persuades the Spartans not to surrender Lycurgus, one of the Spartan kings, to the Aeginetans. He delivers this speech in the law court, the dicasterion, one of only 4 references to dicasteria in the histories, though there are other passages which may refer to legal proceedings. Herodotus is criticised by some scholars for his vagueness about legal institutions. So Millender, for example, comments on the contrast between his detailed treatment of kings and the rather sparse presentation of Sparta's constitutional structure by Herodotus. And she refers to his weaknesses, including the use of vague, imprecise language. I think this focus on legal institutions is misplaced. It is more likely that Herodotus's concept of the rule of law was not based, as is our modern concept, and indeed the concept in classical Athens, on access to the courts, on forensic oratory, on legal institutions. Herodotus, rather, places law in a social context, rather than giving us legal structures, rules, and procedures of which he or his sources may have been ignorant. How, therefore, does he construct a narrative in which the rule of law is explored, debated, and challenged, in which law court scenes and forensic oratory do not play a key role? We need a wider institutional approach. Here, I have found the theoretical approach of the new institutionalists helpful. They extend the definition of the word institution beyond its formal structures to include as well its customs and practices, its informal codes of conduct, and its ideological framing devices. An institution, therefore, is a combination of its formal architecture, its laws and constitutions, its informal practices, the rules of the game, how we do things, what we take for granted. So this is how we bury our dead. And its norms and ideologies, our attitudes, values, our beliefs. So our burial practices are part of what define us as Greek. Lowndes and Roberts term these legitimizing narratives, the stories of how we do things. Rules, practices, and narratives, therefore, all constrain and need to work together to ensure the survival of the institution. Enforcement is achieved through a combination of sanctions. Those who break the formal rules of the institution will be punished, but this coercive action is reinforced by social practices such as shaming, displays of disapproval and social isolation, and by narratives which include incomprehension, ridicule, attacks on one's reputation and credibility, and criticism of nonconformity. So the rule of law in this wider institutional sense is intended to constrain and regulate people's behaviour and provide enforcement mechanisms for that purpose. We find this in both 7:104, the despotes nomos, which compels Spartan men to win or die, and 3:38, the regulation of everyday life, which leads Herodotus to say that nomos is king, basileus. So I'm going to apply this firstly to my analysis of Demaratus's despotes nomos. This nomos operates within the institutional framework introduced by Lycurgus. However, the nomos is also enforced through informal means. The sense of personal obligation is reinforced by social pressure and narratives that create identity through conformity, the shaming of those who fail to perform this rule. Cowardice, failing to live up to the Spartans' nomos of win or die, is shameful. In Book 1, Orthriades commits suicide because he was too ashamed, ischounomenon, to return to Sparta after the Battle of the Champions at Thyrea, when he was the only Spartan to survive. Aristodemus, who did not fight at Thermopylae, is excluded from civil society. He is shunned and shamed. He becomes the object of contempt and only redeems himself by fighting to the death at the Battle of Plataea. There is a social stigma to being called a coward. The rules are enforced at home by women as well as men. Aristodemus is punished through social exclusion. Though Hodkinson writes that cowardice in battle was a public affair, subject to official investigation and adjudication, juridical and political penalties are not mentioned by Herodotus. In his narrative, the penalty is informal, not imposed through formal institutional means, but through communal punishment. Of course, there is a rhetorical aspect to this. To what extent were these rules practiced? Ducat finds that offences linked to the crime of cowardice were not strictly defined or codified, but part of Sparta's official ideology, so a legitimizing narrative, the image Sparta presented to the outside world. Indeed, the Spartans knew of this nomos. Mardonius here taunts Pausanias with failing to live up to it. Ducat argues, therefore, that the trembler was an ideal construct to mask divergence from Demaratus's code. We can see this in Pausanias's military strategy at Plataea, which has to take account of the practical effects of war. When the Persian cavalry blocked the army's water supply, Pausanias and the other Greek commanders make a strategic decision that it's better to retreat than to engage in battle immediately. Amompharetus, however, takes the Spartan despotic nomos literally, so retreat becomes an act of cowardice. He is not willing to bring shame on Sparta by retreating from the strangers. He has internalized the Spartan nomos and has to be persuaded that he doesn't always have to adhere to despotes nomos. Yet Pausanias's tactics prove correct. He achieves a successful outcome by using tactics and strategy to defeat the Persians, not by conforming to despotes nomos. So we can see that the rule, the nomos in practice, may be more flexible than the ideology, but we also see how the nomos creates a legitimizing narrative which defines what it is to succeed as a military Spartan male, and which the events of Thermopylae make part of Spartan's own story and identity. Demaratus's statement is, of course, also a very significant statement of the rule of law taking precedence over the rule of one man. We fear nomos much more than we fear a tyrant. As Douglas Cairn says, the Spartans' fear of the law is not just fear of punishment or even of disgrace, but respect for a set of values to which Spartans as a community are committed. So the rule of law in the histories combines external force, coercion, with internal pressure, the need to belong and be identified as adopting the practices and beliefs of the community. I'm going to turn now to consider the rule of law as an ideal, as a bulwark against tyranny. As we saw in the UN definition, adherence to principles of fundamental human rights is a key part of the modern rule of law and is non-negotiable. Bingham roundly rejects a thin definition, since respect for human rights and good governance, in his view, are inseparably linked. The rule of law requires that the law afford adequate protection of fundamental human rights. These are to be found in the UK in the Human Rights Act 1998, which incorporates the articles of the European Convention on Human Rights. Lord Bingham also regards the rule of law as an important bulwark against tyranny, noting that the European Convention on Human Rights was a response to the tyranny of Nazi Germany and the communist USSR. Brian Tamanara, who has written extensively on the rule of law, also concludes that the concept of the rule of law acts as a restraint on government tyranny, prompting questions on necessary limits to government, the justice of laws, the role of law in providing for the good of the community. Lord Bingham also points out that we can recognise the rule of law by its absence. The arbitrary use of power and the lack of restraint on the exercise of that power, as he points out, leads to this non-exhaustive list of consequences. So what are the values underpinning the rule of law in the histories? We clearly can't import modern thick definitions of the rule of law into Herodotus's Histories, because that definition relies on a commitment to universal human rights and to equality and non-discrimination, which is both anachronistic and would be incomprehensible to Herodotus, let alone to his audience. This was a world which institutionalized slavery and gave the right to enslave conquered peoples, and in which gender equality was either a mythical construct, as with the Amazons, or on the edges of the known world, the Isidonians in Book 4, who are both law-abiding and where women have equal power with men. However, there are three key values which tyrants are particularly prone to disregard. Firstly, they disregard rules which bind everyone. So those who destroy their own oikos break a fundamental rule of law that imposes an obligation to protect it and avoid the empty oikos. Family relationships create reciprocal expectations. My honor and status deserve to be recognized by you, but in return, you have a legitimate expectation that I will respect your honor and status. This is Candaulus's mistake. He forgets his wife's legitimate claims and dishonors her. And Cambyses' wife accuses him, with this metaphor, of threatening his natal oikos by killing his brother. Secondly, tyrants sometimes forget the limits, the boundaries on human ambition and power. The rule of law operates in a world, in Cairnes's words, permeated by the divine, in which the gods are believed to punish those who ignore limits which are implicit in the unwritten laws of the gods, who exercise power in an arbitrary way, and who show excessive confidence in their own abilities and powers. They show the kind of thinking big that exercises the indignation of the gods, who do have the power to sanction such excess and overconfidence. So Pheretime, for example, is punished by the gods for her excessive vengeance against the Barcians. Cannavaro contrasts eunomia, good law, with hubris. So eunomia is linked to order, rules of behavior, proper dealings with others, including the gods, respect of one's own and others' rights and prerogatives, and knowing one's place. Whereas hubris involves overstepping the mark, improper, disrespectful, or dishonorable dealings with others, including the gods. This is a much wider concept of the rule of law than one based on political institutions. It reflects the unwritten rules of family, community, and the gods, who are believed to intervene when power is exercised by those who think the rules do not apply to them and forget the limitations of being human. Finally, tyrants sometimes act as if they are subject to no rules at all. An inherent problem with tyranny is that the monarch is judge as well as ruler, high priest, and military leader. Some tyrants show a capacity to rethink their decisions. Darius, for example, revokes the punishment of crucifixion on Sandoces in Book 7. But tyranny as an institution contains no measures that will allow subjects to hold their rulers accountable. So Cambyses, for example, does consult an authority other than himself, the royal judges, but they, out of fear, tell him that he can do what he wants, thereby authorizing him to act without constraint. And he kills his wife and their unborn child when she reminds him, as we've seen, that he has broken his obligations by killing his brother. This is the accusation made by Otanes in the constitutional debate, that a monarch subverts a country's ancient laws, rapes women, and kills men without trial. And he contrasts this with isonomia, equality before the law. Sometimes, therefore, Herodotus highlights the importance of the rule of law by showing its absence through the arbitrary and unchecked abuse of power by tyrants, often within the oikos. I'm going to use the stories of Deioces and Astyages to show that though Deioces creates the institution of tyranny, his rule is not characterized, as Astyages is, by acts that are unlawful, nomos. Harris argues that the tyranny of Deioces was the antithesis of the rule of law in Greek eyes, since he promoted law and order as a means to gain power rather than as an end in itself, whereas for Solon, the rule of law was an alternative to the rule of man. I will suggest that while I don't think Median or Persian tyranny could ever satisfy a thick definition of a rule of law based on Greek values, there is a distinction to be drawn between the thin rule of law created by Deioces and the absence of law under Astyages. I will argue that the way Herodotus structures his storytelling highlights the difference between the two kings, the gap between authoritarian legality under Deioces and lawlessness under Astyages. Let me start with Deioces. He sets up a relationship with the Medes based on his role as the embodiment of justice. He creates rules to combat lawlessness, anomia, because he wants to be tyrant. The Medes have already resisted an external power, the Assyrians, and they have become autonomous. Why then do they return to the rule of tyranny internally? The Medes are not coerced. They choose Deioces to be their judge and eventually will agree only to be judged by him. However, it is very clear from Herodotus's narrative that Deioces skillfully manipulates his position and the community's desire for law and order to achieve his ends. To that extent, he shows the uncommon skill and success as a political operator that, in Anderson's view, distinguishes tyrannoi from other oligarchic leaders, in that they win the support of the community and thus a degree of legitimacy. He offers an alternative to an unfair and ineffective system of justice, which does not command the respect of the community. After a while, he is the only judge with a reputation for giving evidence-based judgments and decides to stop doing so on the basis he was having to neglect his own affairs. This leads to the breakdown of law and order. And from this passage, we see that the Medes have a forum for debate. They meet together, they make speeches, and they persuade themselves to be governed by a king, albeit following a debate that was dominated by Deioces' friends, in Herodotus' opinion. Part of their motivation is a wish for stability, so that they can work and not be driven from their homes through lawlessness. They pay a heavy price for this. Deioces forces the Medes to build him one city. This forcing, the ananker, is echoed in the Astyages story, as we will see, when Harpagus compels Mithridates and Astyages then compels Mithridates to tell the truth. This is the point in the Deioces story when we begin to see aspects of his tyranny which would be the antithesis of the rule of law in Greek eyes. Firstly, he starts by isolating himself. He no longer has to be seen to perform the role of judge effectively. His accountability to the Medes is decreasing. No one has the right to speak to him or argue with him, and the use of intermediaries emphasizes his supremacy as well as his isolation. We see that the language has changed from choice, debate, and face-to-face justice to coercion, written judgments, and a network of informants. As Baragwanath points out, the walls of Ecbatana symbolize in effect the transformation of Media from the autonomous rule of villages to the centralized tyranny of Deioces, which creates an institution and legal system based on coercion. Moreover, tyranny is intolerant of private worlds. Deioces has spies and eavesdroppers everywhere. However, there are aspects of this story which, we'll see, distinguish it from the story of Deioces' great-grandson Astyages. While Deioces is harsh, his rule is not arbitrary, and he does nothing either to threaten the integrity of his oikos or to risk foreign campaigns. I suggest, therefore, that while the story is clearly part of Herodotus's explanation of why things happen and how the political nomos of tyranny can arise, Herodotus also contrasts Deioces with Astyages, who invites retribution. Herodotus shows a man who shows some skill in pursuing power, marketing his image effectively. Herodotus shows us a community which chooses tyranny through a process that includes debate and consideration of options, and Deioces has to interact with the community. He imposes harsh nomoi as tyrant, but initially at least with the consent of the Medes and the support of his friends. This story, therefore, illustrates the interaction of ruler and community, whereby nomos is increasingly coercive, but is the price the community pays for not being driven from their homes through lawlessness. Deioces creates a rule of law in the thin sense of rules which not only coerce the subject, but also facilitate community life. Herodotus, however, also signposts the lack of accountability of king to subject, the use of spies, and the lack of a proper system of due process, which become markers of the absence of the rule of law in the hands of other tyrants. This reminds us that, as Tamanara points out with regard to the modern rule of law, law can be both bad, unfair, or harsh, yet still be consistent with the rule of law. Astyages inherits the formal architecture of royal tyranny created by Deioces. The royal oikos, though, is of much greater significance in this story. The model of new institutionalism includes marriage and the family as institutions which should be investigated. Informal practice may, and often will, reinforce and legitimize the formal institutions which underpin marriage and family, keeping power relations intact and resisting innovation and change. In the 5th century BCE, therefore, marriage is an institution which has clear objectives: to transmit social identity and status, to maintain social and kinship networks, and to provide heirs. The oikos as well is an institution, both a physical structure and a network of relationships. The danger of the empty oikos is a persistent motif in the histories, imposing an obligation on everyone to preserve, not destroy, the oikos. That is the significance of the Pythia's rebuke to Glaukos in Book 6, when she warns him that those who break their oaths will suffer the destruction of their whole household. Conversely, there is a strong message in the histories that kinship and family bring good fortune. Tellus the Athenian in Book 1 is the example given by Solon of a fortunate man, not only because he died an honourable death, but also because he had good and noble sons who themselves all had children who survived. Herodotus signals throughout the histories the importance of preserving the oikos and the dangers of the empty oikos. We also see that from time to time, the values of family and marriage undermine relationships of power, as we see in the Astyages story, when a slave woman promotes the values of family over a tyrant's command. So I'm going to focus on the royal oikos as an institution, both as a centre of power and as a household. The word oikos is used most frequently in the histories of the king's household. As an institution, it has significance both politically and rhetorically. It is the place where most influential interviews would take place and where people would have to negotiate their relationship with the king, but also where some would exercise some agency as advisors. The preservation of the royal oikos is of great significance, therefore, since it is not only a dynastic base, but also a centre of power. Consequently, characters in the histories signal loyalty to the king by referring to the security of the king's house. For example, when Croesus addresses Cyrus before his battle with the Massagettai, he identifies threats to his oikos. "O king, I told you before, when Zeus gave you to me, that I would do all I could to avert any catastrophe I saw threatening your house." What then of Astyages, who seeks to destroy his own oikos? Scholars have identified the mythic and dramatic elements in this story, both in technique and in subject matter, in contrast with the story of Deioces. Pelling notes the dramatic use of speech and the theme of the divided oikos, with Harpagus being presented as a blood relative to the royal house. Consequently, Harpagus' part in the planned murder of the infant Cyrus and Astyages' murder of Harpagus' son both appear as internal familial crimes. The murder of kin, familial violence, the echoes of the myth of Atreus and Thyestes in Astyages' banquet, when he serves up Harpagus' son's dismembered body to his father, and the exposure and survival of a king child also have a mythic quality. It is no surprise that Herodotus explores the institution of tyranny under Astyages and his lack of respect for family and kin by recalling mythical and dramatic examples for his audience. Firstly, Astyages ignores the expectations of him as father and grandfather. The threatening aspect of kin is emphasized right from the start of the narrative. Mandale, his daughter, is seen as a threat by her father following his dream of her flooding Asia with urine, which is interpreted by the Magi in a way that terrifies him. He marries her to her social inferior, the Persian Cambyses, and then plots to kill her son when Mandale becomes pregnant and he learns that her offspring will rule instead of him. In marrying her to a foreigner out of fear, not as a calculated marriage alliance, he thereby acts against the unwritten but well understood objectives of marriage. He undermines her social identity and status. He rejects the need to make social and kinship networks, as his own marriage to Aristodemus was itself aligned to a peace treaty between the Lydians and the Medes. And though his daughter fulfills her female role and produces a male heir, Astyages seeks to kill his grandson. We see in this story one of the legacies of Deioces' rule, namely the habit of using intermediaries to carry out orders in a hierarchy of command. Astyages commands Harpagus to kill Mandale's baby, and Harpagus commands Mithridates to carry out the order. There is no attempt to persuade. Astyages gives orders backed up by threats, unspecified in the case of Harpagus, and all too specific in the case of Mithridates, who is threatened with torture if he disobeys. So in this scene and at the subsequent banquet, when Astyages kills Harpagus' son, he personifies tyranny in its most coercive sense. However, in the end, though Astyages is all-powerful and can issue coercive orders, ultimately he is not in control. His orders to kill the child are disobeyed, both by his subordinate Harpagus and by a slave woman Sino. His advisors give the wrong advice, to return Cyrus to his parents, for example, and within his family, his actions earn him the resentment of his daughter and the desire for revenge from Harpagus. In Herodotus's judgment as narrator, Astyages is responsible for losing his empire through his harsh, cruel behaviour. He is described by Herodotus as sent mad by the gods, Theoblabes, when he appoints Harpagus to be his general. He makes Harpagus his commander in the campaign against the Persians, forgetting his likely desire for revenge. If the king is sent mad or made to act irrationally by the gods, what connection can he claim to divine authority? This contrasts with the story of Deioces, in which there is no divine element, but order is maintained and rules established, albeit at the price of submitting to a tyrant. Sometimes the rule of law is recognizable by its absence. In this story, we see Astyages characterized by lack of restraint, who fails to recognize his obligation to protect, not destroy his oikos, and he is driven mad by the gods. The murder of Harpagus' son is one of only 2 occasions in the histories where Herodotus uses the word anomos, unlawful, describing the banquet when Harpagus served the remains of his son. The other occasion is when Gyges begs Candaulus not to make him do wrong in looking at his naked wife. In both cases, the word anomos highlights the absence of law. There is a complete lack of any insight on the path of both Candaulus and Astyages. Neither of them at any point show any self-knowledge or act as if any rules apply to them. And this makes them different even from Cambyses, who also destroys his own oikos, but does realise before he dies that he's killed his brother by mistake. Candaulus and Astyages not only break rules, they conduct themselves as if those rules didn't exist. I think, therefore, that it is possible to discern a thick version of the rule of law in the histories, if we consider the rule of law as a bulwark against those tyrannical regimes which flout the rule of law. They do so by, firstly, disregarding the rules which bind everyone. Those who destroy their own oikos break a fundamental rule of law that imposes an obligation to protect it. Secondly, they ignore limits which are implicit in the unwritten laws of the gods and of communities. And thirdly, they exercise power in an arbitrary way, lacking all accountability. So to conclude, the rule of law in the histories is a powerful force and a normative ideal. As a normative ideal, Herodotus shows that it is often broken, undermined, and distorted, usually by those who have the power to disregard rules. However, Herodotus also shows the consequences for those who do so, and he thereby asserts the rule of law over everyone. Though we cannot identify in Herodotus a concept of universal human rights, I think we can discern a belief in a concept of a rule of law which acts as a check on the powerful as well as the rest of society. In one important respect, there is a relationship between the modern and the Herodotean concept, namely that, in the words of Gina Miller, who was one of the people who brought the Supreme Court case I referred to at the start, our laws are all that protect us from tyranny, and before them, we are all equal. Thank you.